The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the ceiling. Not the sound of machines, not the pain in my chest, though that came a half-second later. The ceiling. It was white. That particular institutional white that exists nowhere in nature. The kind that absorbs light instead of reflecting it. I had seen ceilings like that in field hospitals in 3 different countries. I knew exactly where I was before a single person spoke to me. Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Germany. A bed on the 4th floor. If the window's angle and the particular way afternoon light entered told me anything. And after 22 years in the United States Marine Corps, I had learned to read rooms the way other people read faces. I was alive. That was the first thought. Clean and simple. I was alive. The second thought, which arrived with considerably more weight. I shouldn't be. I had been a colonel for 4 years. Before that, lieutenant colonel for 3. Before that, I had spent 2 decades learning how to make myself useful in places where usefulness was measured in whether your unit came home. The mission that landed me in that bed, I cannot tell you its name or its location, because some things belong to the classified record and will stay there. What I can tell you is that there was an explosion, a structural collapse, and a period of time afterward that I cannot account for in any conscious sense. My executive officer, Major Reyes, told me later that the rescue team found me under 6 feet of debris, that I had been in a coma for 173 days. Nearly 6 months. My first week of consciousness was consumed by the body's demands. Pain management, physical assessment, relearning the simple negotiations between brain and muscle that most people accomplish without thinking. My left shoulder had been reconstructed. 2 ribs had healed wrong and required resetting. I had lost 21 pounds. The neurologist, a careful woman named Dr. Adler, measured my cognitive function with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and was relieved when the results came back intact. I did not ask about my family in that first week. I noticed that, later, the fact that I didn't ask. I told myself it was because I was focused on recovery. That was partially true. The fuller truth is that something in me was already waiting, already sensing a particular quality of silence around the subject that I had learned, over many years, to recognize as the silence that precedes bad news. My commanding general, a woman I had served under for 6 years and respected enormously, flew in on the 8th day. Brigadier General Watkins. She brought flowers, which she was visibly embarrassed by, and set them on the window ledge with the expression of someone who had done a thing and could not undo it. We talked for 40 minutes about the mission, about the investigation, about my medical timeline, and the Corps' plans for my recovery. She was direct. She was kind. She was careful. It was that carefulness that told me what was coming. She placed a single folder on my bedside table. "There are some things you should know before you speak with your family," she said. "I thought you should hear it in a controlled setting. From someone who—" She paused. General Watkins was not a woman who paused. "From someone who gives a damn about what happens to you." I opened the folder. I read it once. Then I set it down on my lap and looked at the ceiling again, that particular institutional white. And I sat with what I had just read, for a very long time. The documents were straightforward, which is the cruelest thing they could have been. A transfer of property deed, dated 4 months into my coma. My grandfather's estate, a 12-acre property in Virginia, that Colonel Raymond Earl Hayes had built over 40 years of military service and left specifically in his will to be divided between me and my father, had been transferred entirely into a trust controlled by my brother, Daniel, and my stepmother, Patricia. A separate document showed that my personal savings account, for which Daniel had been granted emergency power of attorney on the grounds that I was incapacitated with no expected recovery, had been drawn down significantly. The trust fund my grandfather had established for me, the one he had told me about in the last conversation I ever had with him, 6 weeks before he passed, 2 years before my deployment, had been rerouted through a legal mechanism I would need a lawyer to fully untangle. There were also 2 letters, one from Daniel to my father, which I will not quote directly, because some of its contents still require me to breathe deliberately when I think about them. The summary is that my brother had told my father I had chosen my military life over this family for the last time, and that given I had likely not survived, it was time to make practical decisions. The second letter was from Patricia to the estate attorney. Its tone was efficient, almost businesslike. She wrote that, as my father's wife and primary caregiver, he had developed early-stage dementia, which I had not known, which hit me somewhere separate from everything else. She was acting in the family's best interest. The family's best interest. I sat with those words for a while. My father, I need you to understand something about my father before you understand the rest of this story. Harrison Hayes was a quiet man who loved order and struggled with conflict the way some people struggle with heights. Not through lack of courage, but through a kind of constitutional discomfort he had never fully overcome. He had been a good father when I was young, and a gradually more distant one as his second marriage and his health complications consumed more of his attention and energy. He was not a cruel man. He was not a calculating man. He was an old man with a deteriorating mind who had been surrounded at his most vulnerable by people who knew how to use his vulnerability. That is not an excuse, but it is a context, and I have found over the years that context is the only thing standing between understanding and hatred. I chose understanding, because I had watched what hatred did to people in the field, and I had no interest in becoming that. I did not cry in that hospital room. I want to be honest about that, not to perform composure, but because it is true, and the reason it is true matters. I didn't cry because the grief was too large for tears. It was the kind of grief that sits below crying, in the part of you that goes very still. I had felt it once before, when my grandfather died, the feeling of something structural being removed. General Watkins was watching me carefully. I looked up from my lap and met her eyes. "Thank you for telling me directly," I said. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I thought about that question for a long moment. I thought about Daniel opening a door to a house that had my grandfather's handprints in the architectural choices, my grandfather's service flags still folded in the study. I thought about Patricia writing a businesslike letter about practical decisions while I was unconscious under 6 feet of rubble. I thought about my father, confused and led, signing documents he may not have fully understood. I thought about what my grandfather had told me in our last conversation. He had gripped my hand with both of his, and said in the careful way of a man who knows he is running out of time, "Whatever happens, Eleanor, you don't beg, you stand." His name was Colonel Raymond Earl Hayes, United States Army, retired. He had served in 2 wars, he had built something worth protecting, and he had spent the last years of his life making sure it was protected. "I'm going to stand," I said. It wasn't dramatic when I said it. It was simply the only answer. I reached over to the bedside table, picked up the folder, and placed it carefully in the drawer beside my bed. Then I asked General Watkins if she could find me something to write with. I had some notes to take. I will not beg. I will only walk toward the truth. That decision, made quietly in a hospital room in Germany, with a reconstructed shoulder and 21 missing pounds, was the beginning of everything that followed. I was discharged from Landstuhl 6 weeks after I woke up, and transferred to Walter Reed for continued rehabilitation. The shoulder required another procedure. The ribs healed at their own pace, indifferent to schedules. I spent 11 weeks in total at Walter Reed, doing physical therapy at 0600, reading legal documents in the afternoon, and relearning how to trust my body in the evenings when the corridors went quiet. I did not contact my brother or my stepmother during this time. I had considered it, the way you consider a move on a board before you understand the full position. In the end, I decided the first contact should be in person, unannounced, and in civilian clothes. No rank visible, no signal of what I was planning. I wanted to see, clearly and without the distortion of expectation, what I was walking back into. Major Reyes had driven up from Quantico to see me twice during my recovery. She brought my personal items from my quarters, my grandfather's watch, which I had left behind when I deployed, a photograph of him in his army greens, and a small worn Bible that had belonged to his mother. She also, without my asking, and without making a significant thing of it, compiled a preliminary document of financial records from the period of my coma. Reyes was thorough in a way that other people call excessive, and I call essential. I had taught her that, and I was grateful she had learned it. The morning I drove to the house, it was October. Virginia in October has a particular quality of light, clear and slightly melancholy, the way the year behaves when it knows what's coming. I wore dark slacks, a gray coat, and boots. No insignia, no indication of anything. I drove my own car, which had been stored by a friend during my deployment, and I took the back roads because I needed the 45 minutes of driving to settle myself into the right internal state. Not cold, not angry. Simply present. The house appeared at the end of the long gravel drive, exactly as I remembered it. My grandfather had built the main structure in the 1960s and added to it over the decades. A wide front porch, dark wood siding that he had restained himself every 3 years until his knees wouldn't allow it. A flagpole at the corner of the property where an American flag flew whenever he was home. The flag was still there. Someone had left it up. I noted that without assigning meaning to it, because I had learned to be careful about what I assigned meaning to. I parked at the edge of the drive and walked to the front door. Daniel answered on the third knock. He was 41, 4 years younger than me, and he had the look of a man who had recently become comfortable in a way that didn't suit him. He was wearing a shirt I half recognized as something he wouldn't have bought himself, and he'd put on weight in the particular way of someone whose anxiety had been recently resolved. He looked at me with an expression that moved through several phases in under 2 seconds. Recognition, surprise, something that might have been guilt, and then, deliberately, visibly, a hardening. Eleanor. He didn't step back from the door. I heard you were recovering. I am, I said. A pause, the kind that people fill when they are deciding which version of themselves to present. He chose the version I had expected, because Daniel had always chosen the easier thing. You have no right to be here anymore, he said. You need to understand that. The transfers were legal. Dad agreed to everything. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the 173 days I had spent unconscious while those transfers were being arranged. I thought about what it meant to plan for a person's incapacitation as though it were an opportunity. I did not say any of that. I understand you believe that, I said. She was a trim woman in her early 60s, with the particular kind of poise that requires constant maintenance. She had never been warm toward me. Not hostile exactly, just economical with her regard. As though I were a line item in a budget she was perpetually trying to reduce. She looked at me now with an expression that managed to combine irritation and something almost like unease. I didn't think we'd be seeing you, she said. We were told the prognosis wasn't good, I offered. She adjusted her expression. We were managing a very difficult situation. Your father's health, the estate, there were decisions that needed to be made. I know, I said. I've read them. The brief silence that followed was informative. This isn't your house anymore, Eleanor, Patricia said, and her voice had recovered its composure by then. I know that's hard to hear, but it's the legal reality. If you want to contest something, that's what lawyers are for. I reached into my coat pocket and took out my phone. I photographed the front of the house, the porch, the door, the flagpole in the corner of the frame. I put my phone away. Daniel was watching me with something between wariness and contempt. What is that supposed to mean? Documentation, I said simply. I turned and walked back down the gravel drive to my car. Behind me, I heard the door close, not slammed, which surprised me slightly. Perhaps even they understood, on some level, that slamming it would have revealed too much. I sat in my car at the end of the drive for a while, long enough to watch the light shift on the front porch, the shadows of the oak trees moving slowly across the wood. My grandfather had planted those oaks. He had planted them as saplings and watched them grow for 50 years. I had climbed them as a child while he stood below, hands in his pockets, watching with that quiet expression he had. The expression of a man who found his satisfaction in seeing things develop correctly. I turned the key and drove. Colonel Edmund Hargrove, United States Army retired, lived in a small house 12 miles from the courthouse in Fairfax County. A house that was overwhelmed in the best possible way by 78 years of accumulated papers, military texts, framed commendations, and the general archaeology of a life spent in service to the legal mechanisms of the armed forces. He had been my grandfather's lawyer, and more than that, his closest friend for the last 30 years of their respective careers. He had called me at Walter Reed 3 weeks after I regained consciousness. I had not called him first, but in retrospect, I should have known he would call me. He had been waiting. He answered the door before I knocked, which told me he had been watching for my car, and he looked at me with the measured assessment of a man who was tallying the gap between what he'd feared and what was standing in front of him. He was smaller than I remembered. Time does that to people, but his eyes were exactly the same, precise, unhurried. The eyes of a man who had spent decades in rooms where language mattered. "Colonel Hayes," he said, using my rank deliberately, "come inside." His study was where we sat. He had a file laid out on the desk, with the careful organization of someone who had been adding to it for a long time. He did not ease into what he had to tell me. He was a man who had spent his career understanding that false gentleness was its own kind of cruelty. "Your grandfather came to me 14 months before he died," he said. He was concerned about the direction of certain family dynamics. I'll use his language, because it was precise. He was specifically concerned about what might happen to your inheritance in the event that you were ever incapacitated in the field. He paused and looked at me directly. He knew you. He knew your service. He understood the statistical reality of what you did, even if he never said so outright. He asked me to prepare documents that would be filed with the military legal office, not with any civilian attorney, not with anyone who could be reached through ordinary channels. Documents that would protect your share of the estate in the event of any legal maneuver made during your incapacity. He slid a folder across the desk. I opened it. Inside was a secondary legal instrument, a protective covenant specifically constructed to prevent the transfer of my designated inheritance without my conscious, witnessed consent. It had been filed with the Judge Advocate General's office. It was, Colonel Hargrove explained with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done his work well, entirely legally binding. The transfers Daniel and Patricia had arranged were challengeable. Not merely challengeable. They had moved money and property without knowing that an instrument existed specifically to contest exactly what they had done. They hadn't known because they hadn't thought to look in the right places. They had looked at civilian records, civilian attorneys, civilian institutions. They had not looked at the military legal office because it had not occurred to them that my grandfather, a man who thought in military structures his entire life, would file his most important protections in the system he trusted most. I closed the folder and sat with it in my lap. He knew, I said. It wasn't a question. It was the recognition of something I had already understood about my grandfather. Confirmed. He knew you, Colonel Hargrove said again, and he knew them. He loved them too, in his way. But he understood what love sometimes cannot fix. He folded his hands on the desk. I've been waiting 6 months to show you this. I wasn't willing to hand it to anyone else. I looked at the folder in my hands, at the careful legal language my grandfather had arranged, from beyond his death, to stand in the gap when I couldn't stand myself. I sat in that study for a long time after that. We talked through the specifics. We talked about strategy. Colonel Hargrove had already been in contact with 2 witnesses. He had already begun the process of filing. When I left, I stood on his front porch for a moment in the October air, the folder under my arm, and I thought about my grandfather's voice the last time I had heard it. Whatever happens, Eleanor, you don't beg, you stand. He had built me a place to stand. He had done it quietly, without telling me, because he understood that some protections only work if they're invisible until the moment they're needed. They thought silence meant surrender. They forgot what soldiers are trained to do in silence. The 3 weeks between my visit to Colonel Hargrove's study and the court date were structured the way I had learned to structure preparation in the field. Methodically, without urgency, with the understanding that thoroughness is the only form of confidence that holds under pressure. I rented a room at a small inn 20 minutes from the estate. I chose it because it had a large desk, a reliable wireless connection, and a proprietor who did not ask questions. I set up a working space that looked, by the end of the second day, approximately like a tactical operations center, translated into civilian materials. Financial documents arranged chronologically. Medical records from Landstuhl and Walter Reed, organized by date and relevance. Property records, transfer documents, correspondence. I worked 7 hours a day and stopped at 1800, because I had learned in the field that exhaustion produces errors, and errors cost more than the time you saved by not resting. The financial picture, as it came into focus, was significant. The estate itself, appraised at just under $2 million, had been transferred, along with its contents, its land, and its associated accounts, into the trust Daniel controlled. My personal savings, which I had accumulated over 22 years of relatively modest spending and consistent allocation, had been reduced by approximately 60% during the period of my coma. The trust fund, which my grandfather had established with a specific beneficiary designation, my name, with no provision for amendment without my direct consent, had been rerouted through a process that Colonel Hargrove's preliminary review described, with measured legal precision, as aggressively irregular. Patricia had, I discovered, retained a family attorney named Gerald Fitch, a man who had, to his credit, executed the transfers competently within the channels available to him, and who had, presumably without knowing about the military legal office filing, proceeded as though he were working with a complete picture. He wasn't. That gap in his knowledge was not his fault. It was, however, his problem. My medical records from the period of my coma were straightforward in their relevance. I had been unconscious, ventilated, and under continuous neurological monitoring from the date of the mission until the date of my first voluntary consciousness. There was no legal definition of capacity that could be applied to those months. The power of attorney Daniel had obtained on emergency grounds, a document that specified it was valid only for the duration of demonstrated incapacitation with no expected recovery, had technically expired the moment I regained consciousness. Technically. The question before the court would be whether the actions taken under it before my recovery were reversible. Colonel Hargrove had a clear view on that question. He communicated his view calmly and with precision, but underneath the legal language, there was something that I recognized in the set of his shoulders and the deliberate quality of his silence before he spoke. He was angry. Not at the law, which had been imperfectly used but not wholly subverted, at the people who had used it this way. He was 78 years old, and he had spent his life building legal structures to protect the people who served, and he was angry in the way that principled old men are angry, quietly and without any intention of letting it pass. I appreciated his anger. I kept mine somewhere further down, where it would be useful and not distracting. On the 9th day of preparation, I drove to the Fairfax County Courthouse to file a supplementary document. It was a gray morning, and a light rain had started by the time I parked. I walked from my car to the courthouse entrance, and nearly stepped over a man sitting on the low concrete wall at the edge of the building's shelter. He was in his late 60s, I estimated, layered in the practical, weather-developed way of someone who spent significant time outside, his head down, turning something over and over in his hands. I almost walked past. I stopped, and I'm not entirely sure what made me stop. Something in the way he was holding whatever was in his hands. Carefully, the way you hold something that matters. It was a service pin. 1st Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment. I sat down on the wall beside him. You served with the 1-7? I asked. He looked up. His eyes were clear, clearer than his situation suggested. He studied me for a moment. A long time ago, he said. You know the unit? My grandfather did, I said. Colonel Raymond Hayes. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a name lands with weight. Colonel Hayes, he said slowly. He looked at the pin in his hands. Then he looked at me with an entirely different quality of attention. You're his granddaughter. His name was Sergeant First Class Michael Odom, retired. He had served under my grandfather in the 1980s, and described him, in the straightforward way of men who have worked together in difficult conditions, as the best officer he had encountered in 30 years of service. He had fallen into the gap that catches too many veterans, a combination of factors that I will not reduce to a brief summary, because they deserve more than that, and because Odom himself, once he began talking, made clear that he had never lost his dignity, only his footing. He had been a witness to my grandfather's interactions with the estate attorney in the final year of his life. He had worked occasional grounds maintenance on the property in retirement. He remembered specifically and clearly a conversation between my grandfather and Colonel Hargrove on the back porch of the estate, a conversation about protection, about documentation, about making sure certain things were in the right hands. He was a witness. He didn't know he was until I explained what was happening. He listened carefully, the way soldiers listen, without interruption, processing. I'll testify, he said immediately, whatever you need. I arranged for Colonel Hargrove to contact him formally. I also arranged before I left for the inn's proprietor, a practical woman named Mrs. Farrell, who had, I suspected, seen more complicated situations than she ever commented on, to have a room available for Odom for the duration of the proceedings. He protested briefly. I told him it was a logistics decision, not charity, and he recognized the framing and accepted it. The letter from Gerald Fitch arrived on the 14th day. It was addressed to me at the inn, which told me Daniel had been tracking my location through channels I would need to consider. A letter was formal, legal language deployed in the specific register meant to communicate overwhelming confidence. It summarized, in 5 carefully constructed paragraphs, the legal basis of the transfers, characterized my intended challenge as likely futile, and suggested, with language that stopped just short of explicit, that contesting the matter would be costly, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. I read it standing at the desk, still in my coat from the morning's errand. I read it once, completely. Then I found a manila folder, labeled it Fitch Correspondence, Day 14, and placed the letter inside. I filed it with the rest of the documentation. I returned to the financial records I had been reviewing. General William Caldwell, United States Army, 4 stars, called me on the 16th day. He had gotten my number through channels that only existed because the military is, in certain ways, its own small world, with its own communication networks. He did not introduce himself at length. He said his name, his rank, and then, I served with your grandfather in Korea and again in Germany. I know what's happening. I want to help. General Caldwell was 81 years old, and had the vocal quality of a man who had spent 60 years being listened to, and had never needed to raise his voice to achieve it. He told me he had heard about my situation through an informal chain of mutual contacts. He was specific in his outrage. Not general, not vague, but specific. The use of incapacity as opportunity. The targeting of a military heir's assets during active combat-related incapacitation. The circumvention of protections that existed specifically to prevent this category of violation. I knew your grandfather when he was a young lieutenant and I was a young captain, he said. I know what he built. I know what he intended. A pause. I'd like to speak to that, if you'll have me. I may need you, I said. You'll have me regardless, he said, but I understand why you said it that way. I thought about that conversation for a while after we hung up. about the way certain lives, built carefully over decades, create networks of trust and regard that persist beyond the person who built them. My grandfather had been gone for 2 years, and his presence, the weight of his reputation, the reach of his relationships, the legal structures he had quietly put in place, was still moving through the world, still acting on my behalf. I found that comforting in a way I didn't try to articulate. Some things are felt more accurately than they're described. 3 days before the hearing, Daniel's attorney filed a motion to delay proceedings on procedural grounds. Colonel Hargrove responded within 48 hours with a filing so comprehensive in its documentation, and so precise in its legal refutation, that the motion was denied the following morning. I learned this via a brief text from Colonel Hargrove that read, "Motion denied. We proceed as scheduled. Sleep well." I was not sleeping particularly well, but I appreciated the instruction. The night before the hearing, I sat at the desk in my room at the inn, with my dress uniform laid out on the bed, blue dress A, with all decorations. I had driven to the storage unit where my personal belongings were kept, and retrieved it the previous afternoon. It had been pressed and ready for over a year. I had always kept it that way, out of habit. The metals, however, I cleaned myself. It is a specific task, the careful application of a cloth to metal, the attention to surface and edge, the patience required to do it well. It is also, as I am honest, a ritualistic thing, a way of accounting. Each decoration is a marker of something, a deployment, an action, a decision made under pressure in difficult conditions. Cleaning them is not pride. It is acknowledgement. This happened. I was there. It cost something. It was worth it. I sat at the desk and worked methodically through each one, and in the silence of the room, with the October rain beginning again outside, I thought about my grandfather sitting somewhere, many years ago, doing exactly this. Same gesture, same silence, same understanding of what the next day would require. I placed the last medal back in position and looked at the uniform for a moment. Then I went to bed. I arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes before the scheduled start of proceedings. I sat in my car in the parking structure for 10 of those minutes, not hesitating, but settling. There is a difference. One is the product of doubt, the other is the practice of preparation. I had learned to distinguish them, and to be honest about which one I was experiencing at any given moment. Then I put on my cover, checked my posture in the rearview mirror with the brief objectivity of a person assessing a tool rather than an appearance, and walked to the courthouse entrance. The dress uniform of a United States Marine colonel is not a subtle garment. It is designed, in its original intent, to be visible, a declaration of institution, service, and earned station. Walking through the courthouse lobby in blue dress A, with full decorations, and the silver eagles of a colonel at my collar, was not a theatrical choice. It was a considered one. I had thought about it carefully over the preceding weeks, and arrived at this. The courtroom was where truth was presented in its most formal setting. My service was part of the truth. My rank was part of the context. My grandfather's legacy and mine were inseparable from the case being made. I was not wearing the uniform to impress anyone. I was wearing it because it was the most accurate representation of who I was. The hearing room was smaller than I had expected. A civil proceeding, with a long table for each side, a raised bench for the judge, and a gallery of perhaps 20 seats, most of them occupied. Colonel Hargrove was already at our table when I entered. He stood when he saw me, and in that gesture, the old reflex of a soldier in the presence of a superior officer, I saw something that moved me more than I showed. Daniel was at the opposite table with Patricia and Gerald Fitch. I became aware of them peripherally, did not look directly, did not engage. I had learned a long time ago that the quality of attention you give to a room tells the room something about you, and I was not prepared to give them the specific quality of attention they seemed to expect. But I was aware of the moment they registered what I was wearing. I heard Patricia's voice, low and intended to be private. Is she really wearing that? I sat down. My father was in the gallery. I had known he would be. He was seated near the aisle with a man I recognized as his personal caregiver, an arrangement Patricia had made some months earlier. He was wearing a dark jacket and a tie that he had probably not chosen himself. He looked older than I remembered. He looked when my eyes moved over the gallery in a single sweep, uncertain, the way a person looks when they are in a situation they cannot fully track, with the particular anxiety of someone who knows they have signed things without fully understanding them. He looked at me when I sat down. I looked back at him, briefly. I gave him a small nod, not warm, not cold, simply acknowledgement. He looked away, and in the movement of his eyes away from mine, I saw something that I identified, in the practiced way I had learned to identify things clearly. Shame. Not guilt exactly. Shame. The distinction matters. Guilt is about what you've done. Shame is about what it has revealed about you. I filed that observation and turned my attention to the table. Gerald Fitch opened his case with the efficiency of a man who believed the ground was solid beneath him. He was a competent attorney. Clear language, organized argument, confident presentation. He walked the court through the timeline of the transfers, the validity of the power of attorney, the procedural steps taken, and the absence of any contested action during the period of my incapacity. His argument was essentially this: the transfers were lawful, the documentation was complete, and the challenge was brought by a claimant with no standing to contest actions that were legally conducted in her absence. It was a good argument. It would have been a better argument if he had known about the military legal office filing. He didn't know yet. I watched him while he spoke and noted that he did not know yet, because a man who knows the central weakness of his case does not present with quite that degree of confidence. Colonel Hargrove presented our case in the way he did everything. Methodically, calmly, without inflection or emphasis beyond what the content itself demanded. He was not performing. He was constructing. He began with my service record, not as decoration, but as context. 22 years of active duty, multiple deployments, significant classified action, a decorated career that had kept me for large portions of the past 2 decades in locations and circumstances that precluded regular civilian presence, but had never, by any legal or moral standard, constituted abandonment of anything. He then presented the medical records from Landstuhl and Walter Reed in their full form. 173 days of unconsciousness, followed by 11 weeks of documented recovery. He established with clinical precision that I had been entirely incapacitated, and then, with equal precision, that I had not been expected to remain so, and that the language of the power of attorney had therefore been selectively applied. Daniel, across the table, was very still. Patricia had a particular expression, the expression of someone watching a comfortable situation become less comfortable and recalculating accordingly. Fitch interjected with procedural challenges at 2 points. Colonel Hargrove addressed each one briefly, without agitation, and moved on. The second interjection produced a small, hard silence from the bench, and Judge Miriam Okafor, a woman in her mid-50s with the efficient attention of someone who had been watching people present arguments for 3 decades, said, without looking up from the documents before her, "Mr. Fitch, I'll ask you to save objections for their appropriate moments." Fitch sat back. Daniel glanced at Patricia. Then Colonel Hargrove reached into the second section of his organized folders and removed the filing from the military legal office. He presented it with the calm of someone placing an important document exactly where it belongs. He explained its origin. My grandfather, visiting the JAG office, 14 months before his death, filing a specific protective instrument for a specific purpose. He explained its legal standing. He explained why it was filed in a military context, rather than a civilian one. Because my grandfather was a military man who trusted military institutions and understood, from 6 decades of experience, exactly how to use them. Fitch asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. During the recess, I remained at the table. Colonel Hargrove sat beside me and reviewed notes without speaking. Across the room, I could hear the low, rapid consultation between Fitch and Daniel, and while I could not make out specific words, I could hear the specific quality of a conversation in which one party is realizing that the assumptions on which they had built their position have proven incorrect. I arranged the papers in front of me with small, precise adjustments. It gave my hands something to do. When proceedings resumed, Fitch's approach had shifted. His confidence was intact on the surface, but the structural weight behind it had changed. Like a building that looks complete from outside after something foundational has moved. He challenged the military legal filing on the grounds of jurisdiction, on the grounds of public notice, on the grounds of my grandfather's mental capacity at the time of filing. Colonel Hargrove had anticipated each challenge. He had responses, documents, and in one instance, a sworn affidavit from the JAG officer who had witnessed my grandfather's filing in person. An affidavit that described in specific detail my grandfather's clarity and intent on that day. Then Colonel Hargrove reached for the folder he had placed, without comment, at the far corner of the table when he first sat down. It was sealed, not in a dramatic way, simply a plain envelope with a JAG office seal on the flap, closed and preserved. "Your Honor," he said, "my client's grandfather, Colonel Raymond Earl Hayes, filed a secondary document at the same time as the protective covenant. He requested that this document be sealed and produced only in the event of legal proceedings contesting his granddaughter's inheritance. He specified that it should be opened in court, in the presence of all relevant parties." Colonel Hargrove looked at the judge. "I respectfully request permission to open and enter this document into evidence at this time." Judge Okafor examined the envelope briefly. She looked at the seal, at the filing information on the exterior, and gave a brief nod. Colonel Hargrove broke the seal. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages in my grandfather's careful hand, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was a practiced discipline. There was also, beneath the letter, a secondary will, a codicil executed on the same date as the protective filing, notarized by the JAG officer and witnessed by 2 military colleagues of my grandfather's. The codicil made explicit what the primary will had implied, his specific intent for the estate, his understanding of what it represented, and his instructions for what should happen to it. Colonel Hargrove read the letter aloud. He read it in its entirety, and I want to tell you that I am not going to reproduce every word of it here, because some things belong to the private record of a family and should stay there. What I can tell you is that my grandfather wrote about his granddaughter, me, with a clarity and specificity that came from knowing someone over a long time. He wrote about what I had built, and what I had sacrificed, and what he believed I deserved. He wrote about his son, my father, with love and with concern, and with the particular honesty of a man who knows his letter may be the last word he gets to say. He wrote 2 sentences near the end, that Colonel Hargrove read in the same even tone he had maintained throughout. And those 2 sentences fell into the room the way heavy things fall, not with a crash, but with a finality. If my words are being read aloud in a court of law, then something has gone wrong that I feared might go wrong. I am sorry I could not prevent it, but I prepared for it, because I knew Eleanor, and I knew she would need a foundation to stand on, even when I was gone. Somewhere behind me in the gallery, I heard my father make a sound. Not a word, just a sound. I did not turn around. Fitch was quiet. Daniel had his hands flat on the table. Patricia was looking at a point slightly to the left of everything. I looked at Judge Okafor. She had finished reading her own copy of the document that Colonel Hargrove's associate had provided the bench. She looked up, and in the brief moment before she composed her judicial expression fully back into neutrality, I saw something in her face that I recognized. Not sympathy exactly, something more like recognition. The recognition of a person who has just seen something that is, underneath all its legal clothing, simply true. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. I had not coordinated the timing with General Caldwell. He had told me he would be there. I had not told him when to enter. The timing was his own, and it was either coincidence or the particular instinct of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding how rooms work. General William Caldwell walked into that courtroom in his dress uniform with 4 stars at his collar, and the posture of a man who had walked into difficult rooms his entire life and had never once considered not walking into them. He was 81 years old, and he moved like someone 20 years younger, which is what a life of discipline does if you're fortunate. He introduced himself to the court with the brief efficiency of someone who does not need to elaborate on what his name and rank convey. He gave his testimony in 7 minutes, not long, not dramatic, entirely precise. He spoke about my grandfather's character, his intent, and his legal preparation. He spoke about my service record with the specific knowledge of someone who had tracked it personally. He concluded with a single sentence that he delivered without elevation or performance. Colonel Hayes earned everything she is fighting for. Her grandfather made sure there was a legal record of that. I am here to confirm, for this court, that the record is accurate. He sat in the gallery. Gerald Fitch did not cross-examine. Judge Okafor looked at the materials before her for a considered moment. She asked 3 brief, precise clarifying questions, 2 directed at Colonel Hargrove, 1 directed at Fitch, who answered it in a tone that had entirely shed its earlier confidence. Then she looked at both tables with the evenness of someone delivering a decision she has already fully formed. The protective covenant filed with the Military Legal Office on April 14, 2009, is a valid legal instrument and takes precedence over subsequent transfers made in contradiction of its terms, she said. The emergency power of attorney produced in evidence was granted under specific conditions that were not sustained at the time of the contested transfers, and its application to those transfers is therefore invalid. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Estate and associated accounts are to be restored in accordance with the terms of both the original will and the codicil produced in evidence today. I will enter the specific remedies in writing within 48 hours. She gathered her papers. The sound in the room was mostly silence, the particular silence of a resolution. I looked at the table in front of me. I let out one long, quiet breath. Then I nodded once, a small thing, contained, and looked at Colonel Hargrove, who had his hands folded on the table, and was looking back at me with the expression of a man who has done what he came to do. Outside the courthouse, the air had the clean quality of a day that had resolved itself. The rain from the night before had moved through, and the October light was flat and white and without drama. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it for a moment, just a moment, before putting my cover back on and descending to the walkway. Colonel Hargrove shook my hand on the steps with both of his, the way he had shaken hands my entire life. He said he would call me with the formal details when the written ruling arrived. He looked at me with those precise, unhurried eyes and said, "Your grandfather would be satisfied." He did not say proud. He said satisfied, which was the right word, and I suspected he had chosen it deliberately. General Caldwell paused beside me on his way to his car and touched the brim of his hat in a brief salute, a gesture that had a meaning I understood beyond its form. It said, "I see you. I know what this was." Then he walked on, because that was the kind of man he was, a man who understood when the moment was complete. Sergeant Odom was at the edge of the walkway. He had come to the hearing, as I had arranged, and had given his brief witness testimony in the first portion of proceedings with the clear, unembellished recall of a man who had always told the truth and found it uncomplicated to continue doing so. I shook his hand, and he held mine for a moment longer than a handshake required, and said, with a directness that I found unexpectedly affecting, "The colonel would have been glad to know you fought." "I know," I said. "Thank you for being here." Daniel and Patricia came out of the courthouse behind me, approximately 4 minutes later. I was still standing near the walkway, reviewing a message on my phone from Colonel Hargrove, confirming a few administrative details. I did not move to avoid them, because I had nothing to avoid, and I did not seek the encounter, because I had nothing to seek. Daniel walked past me without speaking. I watched him for a moment. The set of his shoulders, the way he moved when something he had counted on had not materialized, and I felt, with a clarity that surprised me, something that was not satisfaction, and was not anger, something quieter than both. A recognition that he and I had arrived, in this particular way, at the end of something that had begun long before I fell into a coma, and that whatever came next would require different terms entirely. Patricia looked at me as she passed, a brief look, not hostile, not apologetic, assessing. She was already recalculating, I suspected, the way she always recalculated. I did not begrudge her that. It was, in its way, a form of survival. My father found me near my car. He was moving slowly, the caregiver a respectful distance behind him, and he looked smaller than I remembered, which was not the dementia exactly, but the posture of a man carrying something very heavy. He stopped a few feet from me. He looked at my uniform, not with the shock his wife had shown in the courtroom, but with something more complicated. With the expression of a man who is seeing, in a formal way, a person he has known all his life. Eleanor. His voice was careful, fragile in the way of something that might break if it moves too fast. I waited. I didn't. He stopped. Tried again. They told me you wouldn't. He stopped again. His hands were slightly unsteady. I should have asked more questions. I should have. He couldn't complete it. I looked at my father. I thought about who he was, and who he had tried to be, and where those two things had diverged, and how much of that divergence was his fault, and how much of it was simply the accumulated weight of years and illness, and people who were more calculating than he had ever thought to be. I thought about my grandfather, who had loved his son with the same long, complicated love that I was now feeling, standing in an October parking lot, in my dress uniform, looking at an old man who could not finish his sentences. I stepped forward and put my arms around him. Not a stiff embrace, a real one. "Dad," I said, "I forgive you." He made a sound against my shoulder. His hands came up and held my arms. "But I can't undo what silence cost us," I finished. Quiet, close to his ear. Not as an accusation, as a fact. Because he deserved the truth, and the truth, told with care, is not cruelty. I held on for another moment. Then I stepped back, and looked at him. Really looked. And let him see my face, clearly, in the October light. I wanted him to see that I was all right. That I was standing. That whatever had been done, I was still the person I had been. He nodded slowly, something settling in his expression. His caregiver came forward gently, and I watched them walk back to the car. My father moving carefully, one hand on the caregiver's arm. I stood for a while after they drove away. Then I got in my car. The estate was 45 minutes from the courthouse. I knew every turn. I had made this drive hundreds of times, as a child, as a young officer, as a woman coming home from places that had cost something. I made it now as someone returning to something that had always been hers, and was hers again. The gravel drive, the oak trees, the dark wood siding, the flagpole at the corner with the flag still flying, the wide front porch. I parked and sat in the car for a moment. Not long, just long enough to understand that I was here, that this was real, that the thing I had been moving toward for weeks had arrived. I went inside. The house was quiet in the way that cleared spaces are quiet, not empty, but at rest. The furniture was mostly still my grandfather's. His presence was in the proportions of the rooms, in the particular arrangement of the study windows, in the smell of old wood and paper, and something indefinable that belongs to places where good lives have been lived. I walked through each room slowly. I ran my hand along the back of my grandfather's reading chair. I stood at the window of the study and looked out at the oak trees he had planted as saplings, and watched grow for 50 years. On the wall of the study, where it had always been, was a photograph. My grandfather in his army dress greens, young, perhaps 35, standing very straight, looking at the camera with the focused calm of a man who knows where he stands in the world. I had looked at this photograph my entire life. I stood in front of it for a long time. They thought taking what I built would break me. That sentence had been forming in me for months. In the hospital in Germany, in the rehabilitation corridors of Walter Reed, in the rented room at the inn, with the financial documents spread across the desk, in the courthouse parking lot, in the October air. They never understood. I wasn't fighting for the house. My grandfather's young face looked back at me from the photograph. Patient, certain, the face of someone who had built things carefully and trusted that careful things endure. I was fighting, so my grandfather's truth would not be buried with his name. I stood there, in the quiet of the study, in the house that was mine again, with my uniform still on, and the light fading outside, and I said nothing out loud. Some things are felt more accurately than they're spoken. I thought, it's done. And then, the way it always does after something difficult has finally reached its end, the next thought arrived, quieter, not an ending, but a turn. Colonel Hargrove had said something, near the end of our last preparation session, that I had noted and set aside for later. He had said, "There's one more thing your grandfather filed. We don't need it for this case, but you'll want to know about it eventually." He had not elaborated. He had simply looked at me with those precise, unhurried eyes and said, "When you're ready." I looked at my grandfather's photograph for another long moment. I'll be ready, I thought, when it's time. But not tonight. Tonight, I was simply home,